Welcome to Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin. Brainbox is a program of Oklahoma Humanities, a nonprofit organization that strengthens communities by helping Oklahomans learn about the human experience, understand new perspectives, and participate knowledgeably in civic life. You can check out all of our programs at okhumanities.org. I'm your host, Chris Carroll. This episode is part of the Oklahoma Humanities Citizen 2020 initiative, which provides resources to better understand the role of the humanities in a free press and a functioning democracy. This initiative will include a series of Brainbox episodes about our democracy, an expanded Fall 2020 issue of our Oklahoma Humanities magazine, and virtual town hall discussions with journalists and scholars. Check out okhumanities.org for more information. In this episode, we're going to talk about the history, controversies, problems, and some positive aspects of the Electoral College. Our guests are Dr. Aaron Mason and Dr. Eric Schmaltz. Dr. Aaron Mason is a professor of political science at Northwestern Oklahoma State University in Alva. He received his PhD from Northern Arizona University in 2006. He's published articles on American Indian tribal governments and state government interaction, as well as issues dealing with the Founding Fathers and the U.S. Constitution. Dr. Eric Schmaltz is a professor of history at Northwestern Oklahoma State University in Alva. In the summer of 2019, he began serving as the departmental chair of social sciences. Along with Dr. Mason, Dr. Schmaltz is both co-founder and co-director of Northwestern's Endowed Institute for Citizenship Studies and co-editor of its journal, Civitas. Dr. Mason and Dr. Schmaltz recorded a great episode with us last year about the powers of the presidency, so we're really glad to have you guys back today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Good to be back.
Well, let's get into the Electoral College. So where did the idea for this system come from in the first place? Did the creators of it pull from some previous models for this type of election system?
That's a great question. And by the way, I'd like to open today is Constitution Day.
Oh, we're recording
September,
that's right, yeah.
September 17th, 1787. So this is
How
a good time to meet up here. But yeah, there were several probably indirect as well as direct influences leading up to the Electoral College. Again, nothing happens in a vacuum, and certainly the framers and the founders, but the framers of the Constitution in particular, those involved in the process of drafting it, were students of history, very good students of history, especially of antiquity. So among some of the influences was the Centuriate Assembly or the Centurial Assembly of the Roman Republic, that had a kind of a group of electors that could be used for selecting leaders in the Roman Republic. And certainly later on, you have another precedent. It was the College of Cardinals in the late 11th century of the Roman Catholic Church. The princes of the church, noted for their red garb, they select the Pope. That's by election. The College of Cardinals. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church certainly borrowed from the Roman imperial structures. Even the bishoprics go back to the late Roman period. So maybe there's some indirect influences there too in the structure. A little bit more recently, but late medieval period, we have the Golden Bull, B-U-L-L, a legal proclamation or announcement declaration. It's of 1356 for the Holy Roman Empire, which again has a throwback to the Roman period and of course the early Roman Catholic Church. The Holy Roman Empire was founded around the 9th century by Charlemagne of the Franks, and again to combine the Roman and the Christian concept, the Holy Roman Empire. But this empire lasted for nearly a century until the time of Napoleon in 1806. So roughly from 800 to 1806, the Thousand-Year Reich, the First Reich. We have more infamous ones that followed. But they had in the early, in the 1300s, they had some decentralization take place. So they end up electing their emperor. And so it was called the Golden Bull, and basically allowed for 7 electors. 3 of them were from the church. These were ecclesiastical electors, archbishops, high-ranking officials, and then the remaining 4 were secular rulers. One, for example, was from Brandenburg, the future Prussia. The other from Saxony. We think of Frederick the Wise, the great elector. He was Martin Luther's boss, so a little bit later on, and a couple of others. So there's some precedents there. Whether this had direct influence on the framers, I can't say for the fact that it would be the case, but certainly there are more immediate influences that you'll find later. Was an article 2, Article 2, and then also with people like Madison and Hamilton, and I'll let Dr. Mason kind of expand on the more direct contributors to the notion of a electoral college.
But the idea with the ones you described was basically let's get an elite group of people to choose our leader, not direct democracy at all.
Exactly. This idea of having some input and having some kind of representation. It's a very small select group, though, and typically more elite. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the guys that we would associate it among the framers, and it is important to make that distinction between framers and founders. A framer is someone who's involved in the drafting of the Constitution in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787, and or those who are involved in the ratification of the Constitution at the state level subsequent to the drafting of it on September 17th.
Versus the founders.
Or anybody who participates in the revolution essentially in a civic or military capacity.
Okay.
That's a great distinction. It's something I didn't really appreciate after I had met you many, many years ago.
Well,
make a distinction between those two.
It's important because, just as we begin our discussion, because we can quote a great founder like John Adams, but Adams is not really a framer. He's an indirect framer because he does write some works that are inspirational to the framers, but he, of course, doesn't attend the conventions.
And I think even the Massachusetts Constitution was another influence. But
he basically authors the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which predates this. It's the oldest constitution in the world, still functioning, the state constitution. Or Jefferson is a great founder, but he's not a framer. He's in France when the deliberations are going on. Quite concerned, too, that there's this federal constitution occurring without him presiding over it.
That's right.
Who does Washington think he is? And he's not even in favor of that. He wants to maintain the articles because he wants to decentralize the power. But back to the original issue at hand, which is who we would credit this to a certain extent. I think James Wilson of Pennsylvania is a name that comes up. He was a Scottish immigrant, later became a very fascinating guy. He was, if I remember correctly, he was one of the first law professors in the United States to teach a law course, I think at the University of Pennsylvania, but he was a Scottish immigrant. He is kind of credited for being one of the first to promote this idea of some sort of an indirect election. And again, it's not always just this idea of an elite group of people. It's this idea also of creating some degree of separation between the people and who this executive will be to prevent demagoguery, right, where the leader can promise things to the people directly. So you have some sort of indirect election. The people are not as connected to the leader, and the leader can't use them for his own nefarious purposes.
Okay. And again, there are lessons from antiquity and from the Greco-Roman world. So certainly the idea of dictators and the mobs and
in fact, the classic. I really appreciate you mentioned that. The classical allusion I always use in that regard is Antony's speech to the mob. To the crowd. Immediately,
that was a very telling comment.
Which becomes a mob. That's the point. I'm trying to set the mood here, because in Julius Caesar's famous play, Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, when Antony addresses the crowd and then manipulates them into becoming a mob that will turn on his side. And he issues the famous phrase when he says, "Cry havoc, let slip the dogs of war." Because he's turning the mob against the conspirators. He's speaking supposedly on behalf of the conspirators, right, as you know, but he actually is turning them. And I think that this is the type of thing that motivated the founders in part to create this institution, because they were concerned with the idea of mob rule. And that was a common concern and a very legitimate concern in the 18th century, because all attempts to create executives at that point had ended in that. They either ended in despotism, or they ended in mob rule, neither of which is a good alternative.
Yeah, lessons of history. That's where the humanities and history come into play, history being part of the humanities. I've always appreciated that kind of historical perspective and the long view. And I was just going to mention with Wilson, too, he was the head of the Committee of Detail. Yes. And I think he also was the one also, Aaron, with the 3/5 compromise. Yes. So, but very important person. Yeah. So these are more direct influences.
Which plays a role with the EC, as I say, electoral colleges. We'll get through this here. Yeah.
Okay. So what were some of the key parts of the debate over the creation of the Electoral College during the Constitutional Convention? How did were there sort of factions that had different arguments about how to create this sort of system?
Yeah, there were different debates about who would select the president and how. I know there was one argument, why not have the Congress choose the president? But there was a fear of breaking that separation of powers that would upset that principle. So there was some concerns there. And then the other issue too, why not have the state legislatures determine that? Because we had them initially, right, for the Senate up until 1913 with the 17th Amendment, where you had the indirect election of senators of the state legislatures. Well, this was proposed for the presidency during the debates in Philadelphia as well. And again, there's a fear that would erode some of the federal authority by having the states have too much of a role. There was another notion of why not have the state governors choose the president? And again, that might also erode federal authority. Of course, there were debates, too, about whether we should have more than one president. It should be a lifetime appointment, or should we have one for foreign policy and domestic policy, like co-emperors, to do different roles, or should it be for 4 years or lifetime? So there are other debates, too, what to address the president as, right? You end up with Mr. President, something a little bit less royal or
not
regal.
Your Excellency.
Not Your Excellency, or Your Highness. But definitely there were different debates, but there were some concerns about, maintaining some separation of powers here in the national branches of government.
Yeah, I think also just this idea of balancing out the states by population. And that's, of course,
exactly.
I think the pivotal issue here is how do you balance the electoral interests and the statistical relevance of small states in large states. I think that played a major role.
Yeah, the population size, yes.
Yeah, and you have we oftentimes think of this as a pure north-south thing, but that's really not fair because it's not correct. There are some southern states that actually have larger populations than northern states.
Yeah, great point.
So states like New Hampshire and Rhode Island, they're a lot smaller than Virginia. Virginia is actually, I could be wrong, I want to make sure I get this right. I think it's the most populous state until I forget what year it's surpassed, but it's so massive. It's the largest state by geography. It won't be partitioned until the 1860s into West Virginia and Virginia. And the western boundaries, a lot of these southern states and even mid-Atlantic states are not fixed yet, so they can continue to grow. But some of the New England states they're fixed, and they can't become bigger. Their cities can grow large, Providence and Boston. Yeah, those are big cities. But there are states in the north that their populations are not going to get much larger. So this is a problem of not just North and South, not just free and slave states. It's states in general. New Hampshire is worried that New York is going to overtake it. And so is Connecticut to a certain extent. It will not reach the size of Pennsylvania in geography or population. Eventually it'll be overpassed. So I think there's something to be said for that. I think that's just, in my mind, that's the fundamental issue with the Electoral College. And it still is.
Yeah.
It's how do we and it's the same principle, of course, upon which the Senate is established. That's why the founders, we can't look at the Electoral College in a vacuum. We have to see it in the totality of how they designed the other institutions. That's why there's a bicameral legislature with different forms of representation that's both proportional and equal.
To make sure the small states aren't completely ignored or overrun and the big states aren't overrepresented.
Exactly.
To help bind the country.
Yeah.
Well, maybe this is a good time to, and I apologize for this question in advance, but what are just a few key things to know about how the Electoral College system actually works?
It's going to take more than an hour.
Right. Episode part 2.
Yeah.
Well, I think the first thing is to recognize that it is a system that does not respect one person, one vote. It simply doesn't. It does allocate by virtue of the fact that it provides representation to all states, irregardless of their population. Article 4 addresses that issue, that every state is entitled to at least one House member and 2 senators. Well, by virtue of that fact, some states don't meet the minimum number for a congressional district in the first place. So the difference between the minimum number for a congressional district and the number that a state has can be, some people refer to those as ghost voters. So if you need 800,000, this is just a simple number. This is not the number. Say it's 800,000 for a congressional district. And if your state only had 600,000 people,
Think of
you
Wyoming, for
Right.
example.
right, you
Yeah.
get one House member, and that's, of course, not the actual numbers, but we're just playing with the numbers here because to make them simple for math guys. Like, I'm not a
Yeah,
math guy.
this is not the Oklahoma math
No,
council.
no.
My son will laugh at this because he's a math guy if he hears this. He's a math guy. He won't be listening to this.
Maybe later.
Yeah, maybe later. But if you need 800,000, you only have 600,000. Then you have 200,000 ghost voters. Yet you still get the two senators and you get the House member. Well, so a vote in Wyoming is technically more than it is in California. So that's the first thing to know is that it does not privilege one person, one vote. It also, therefore, exaggerates the power of the small states at the expense of large states in close elections, obviously. In a blowout election, it won't matter, or where the margin of victory is sufficient, it's not generally a problem. Another issue is a winner-take-all system in 48 out of 50 states, that when you win the popular vote in a state, you win all the electoral votes for that state, with Maine and Nebraska being the exceptions to that.
Yeah, I was going to mention, Maine was in 1972, fairly recently, and that's an interesting context, too. That's around the time of the McGovern campaign. There were some reforms going on in the superdelegates and selection process for candidates, for nominees for in this case the Democratic Party. But Maine was 1972. Nebraska joined in with that in 1992. So their districts you can split that vote. So I think Nebraska's got 2 districts. So you might have two votes from that district. They could go one way, and then 3 from I can't remember the specific numbers. The other would go to the other candidate.
And any state could do that.
And any state
is
could
free
do
to
that.
declare the way they want to do it.
And Nebraska,
Yes.
I'd like to point out, having lived there, Nebraska likes that kind of distinction. They have the only unicameral state legislature, so along with Maine, they've got this special distinction too. So I kind of like that plan. I mean, I can see that as being kind of we can talk more about that later. As kind of maybe a compromise there, maybe a more nuanced approach to selecting.
It's a very important point that Chris raises, is that one of the keys to understand Electoral College is that it's a decentralized system. It's the states that declare how the electors are chosen. It declares how the ballots are counted. It depends. It declares how they will vote on. Of course, the Constitution requires that they all vote on the same day in their respective capitals. But the manner in which they do they do it by a show of hands? Do they do it by a written ballot? That's all declared by the state. And even to have what are called ballot access laws that determine how the parties can select their electors is all determined by the legislature of the state. The Supreme Court has ruled consistently in a number of important decisions that is a plenary power of the state of the legislature. It's a reserve power of the 10th Amendment that is inherently reserved to the states. Yeah.
So I've heard you say before, I think, is it accurate to say that is a reflection of the president is the president of the United States, not the people. Not the people.
Yeah, of course he is the people. We want to reiterate that he's supposed to represent the people, yes, in a theoretical sense, and to a certain extent in a practical sense. But yes, I always think that's an important distinction to make, because that's why Article 2 says that the states shall select the electors, and the legislatures are in charge of that. And again, the distinction for that, I think, goes back to our original discussion in regards to this idea that the founders wanted to create a degree of separation between the office of the president and the people, so that the president did not have the authority to directly affect the people's lives and to control them. So the more buddy you make him with the people, the more authority he has over you. So if you make him the president of the economy, or the president of whatever need the American people have, it gives him too much power.
Feels more like a king.
It feels more like a king, and ironically, and we are to blame for this, the people today, we always complain about, well, the president has so much control. This election is so important, or that election is so important. Well, it's because we've given the president perhaps more authority, direct authority, than he should have.
Yeah, especially over the last century or so.
Yeah,
it's
been
part
a
of the
slow
Congress.
progression.
Also
Congress has
followed as well.
abdicated,
Yeah.
arguably, a lot of its war-making functions to the president.
Yeah.
And certainly the president that's one of his important roles. I don't mean to disagree that the president is not the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, but the idea of giving the president a blank check every time he asks for it. The Congress can say no. Of course, under the War Powers Act, the president can behave proactively, but the Congress can put a stop to that if they want. They can invoke that. So, but back to the point, the president of the states, he's supposed to represent the states. He's not supposed to represent the people per se. And that's purposeful in the Constitution.
I was just going to add one thing too to that proportional or district plan that Maine and Nebraska have. It's also known as the Munt Plan, M-U-N-D-T. That's named after Senator Carl Munt back in the day. So that was kind of his idea. And to tie in with Dr. Mason, what you said, about this decentralized system, we have 50 different voting. 51. I'm sorry. District of Columbia, 1961, 20.
Right.
23rd Amendment,
right.
yes.
Yeah.
And so we've got 51 different voting systems. I kind of like that decentralized system outside of a few general guidelines, especially with modern technology. If you think about foreign influences, maybe with hacking and things, you have 51 different systems instead of one centralized one. If there is any kind of a hacking or whatever, or other influences with the internet and other things like that, well, you're gonna have to do it to 51 different systems. So maybe that's something I started thinking about in the last couple of election cycles with social media and surveillance systems and so forth. So I just want to kind of throw that out there. It kind of came to me when you mentioned that. And then the other thing, like you said, Dr. Mason, that electoral system, for the states, it forces the candidates to have to go to certain key states too. You can't ignore only focus on a few states especially after you're elected, you want to have some kind of broad mandate. So there's an opportunity for you to maybe gain more support by having to get those electoral votes from some of the other states. So you don't want to just focus only in California or Texas or New York or whatever. So in any case, I just want to kind of throw that out there too. Yeah.
Were there any wild radicals at the framing of the Constitution who advocated for just a pure popular vote? Was that an argument early on, or were people kind of satisfied with this system from the beginning?
Well, it's a bundle of compromises, so I'm wondering if the large states were populous, if that would be more of an issue.
Yeah,
I don't know if anybody being too outspoken about it.
I don't know of any that advocated a pure popular direct election. Certainly, of course, this plays into the idea of Madisonian democracy versus Jeffersonian democracy.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And the Electoral College is a quintessential example of Madisonian. The distinction being this: Jeffersonian democracy says we just take a vote on any issue, the majority wins and the minority loses. Madisonian democracy says not so fast. We have to protect the rights of the minority, no matter what they may be. And so, to answer the question, I can't tell you of a specific individual who advocated for a direct national popular. There may have been one. I'll admit ignorance on that. But I think that, and there were people who advocated Jeffersonian democracy. Like Jefferson at this time. He was more, but of course Jefferson wanted less federal power anyway. He didn't want a powerful executive, except when he was president. Then he wanted the right to buy Louisiana and appoint military governors. Blah blah blah. And we all know
he's not an ideologue. He's more practical.
Correct.
Once you're in power, you can be flexible.
And to be fair, that's what makes him a successful president in his first term, more so. And his second term is difficult, as most presidents find out, if they're lucky enough for a second term. But he advocated the idea that there should just be a vote in any given situation, and then you win. And the minority just has to work harder to convince people to win. But Madison is the one that is more concerned about this idea of protecting minority rights, and we have to have institutional protections and limitations in our system that don't allow the majority to constantly win.
And tied in with that, I was just thinking of the historical context too, late 18th, up until the early 19th century, 1820s and 30s, where you still had property qualifications, religious qualifications. So even those who could vote, it was still kind of restricted to those who, quote unquote, had a stake in the system. So that's built into that along with these other mechanisms. So I think that's a very important point. So I don't think anybody was looking at having just pure democracy per se, which I don't think is even the word democracy is mentioned in the Constitution.
Democracy is never mentioned. In fact, the word democracy, Democrat, those were all pejorative terms because thinking in terms of classical antiquity, they believed that democracy, and this is what most of the ancient thinkers would tell you, that Plato, Aristotle, they said that forms of democracy always become mob rule. And so if you said, I'm a Democrat, that would, or I believe in the concept of democracy, they would assume that you're talking about mob rule.
Oh, that's pretty radical.
Extremely unpopular. Yeah. So,
So did the creators of the Electoral College system foresee how the rise of political parties might affect this election system?
I don't think so,
No.
and we're going to find that out in 1800 and 1804.
Happens pretty quick, right?
Yeah. But the party system was almost like the night after the Constitution was signed or ratified. Actually, it's
Right.
by the mid 1790s you start getting the factions become more formalized, become actual parties, like the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans.
Yeah.
But there's no mention of parties in the Constitution. There was a fear of factions and factionalism. Of course, that goes back to antiquity as well, of putting your own interests above that of the country. But there was not a clear. Certainly, there were warnings by Washington about factionalism, but nobody had anticipated what was to come. And this is just at the beginning of the rise of modern political parties in places like Britain, revolutionary France, the young American Republic. So it's a totally new concept of the beginnings of mass politics.
But with Washington in place, we didn't really have to worry about that for the first term, at least.
Keeps them together.
He's the bulwark that holds it. He's the keystone. Yeah, and I think this is the one area.
The charisma, yeah.
This is perhaps the single area where you can say that most of the founders were idealistic. They were always idealistic, to be fair, but it's hard to accuse.
Letting their guard down a little bit.
Yeah,
here,
they kind of what's the word? They expect too much out of us, you might say, and even the more conservative founders, and when I say conservative, meaning not wanting to embrace radical change quickly, not necessarily the terms we would consider today, but Washington, Adams, the high Federalists. Of course, Washington never joins the party, I know, but guys like Adams, who are very what's the word? Suspicious of human nature.
Yeah.
They have a Hobbesian view of human nature. They're kind of, perhaps we can do this without parties. Yeah, good luck. We go about, you said, without Washington. As soon as we see that, we start to see this develop. In fact, the party system really begins in Washington's first administration with Hamilton and Jefferson. Exactly. And these two very powerful, very intelligent, very ambitious men are not going to sit by and allow their respective interests to not go unrepresented. And so, like you said, in 1800, we have the system essentially break down because under the original arrangement, the electors would cast two ballots independent of each other, and whoever won and you had to cast one for someone from outside your state so that a favorite son wouldn't be selected by each state. Again, try to have this national view with all the states having a chance to win. And then whoever came in first was president, whoever came in second was vice president. Well, in 1800, they basically act as partisans, and no one can get a majority in the Electoral College, and so it goes to the House. And here we go. Who's going to decide this? Well, partisans in the House will decide this. So you've got the electors behaving as partisans. They didn't anticipate that. Then you have the House behaving as partisans. Oops, right? There goes that deliberative body, right? And that is one of, I think, the fair criticisms of the Electoral College today. I don't know if we should get into that just yet, but this is a fair criticism that really the electors are not behaving today as they were initially designed.
So how were they initially
Well, they
designed?
were initially designed to function without parties.
Okay.
Yeah.
And today they are partisan because if you win the electoral vote in Oklahoma, you're in Oklahoma is a pledged elector state. You're supposed to vote the way your party requires. Well, that's really not the deliberative process that the founders envisioned. Today we have, but then again, to be fair to the founders say, well, you get what you want. Well, everybody's saying they want in the state laws, they require that the voters get their way with the electors because we don't want them changing our vote, so to speak. So,
what's the term for that? Is it a false elector?
A faithless elector.
Faithless elector.
Yeah, faithless
Okay.
elector. We don't want them behaving that way. And the majority of states now have pledged electoral laws. So every time we want to criticize it, we have to say, well, but we're getting what we wanted because, as you said very correctly, Dr. Schmaltz said that the states make these determinations. The Constitution is silent on how the electors are supposed to behave. Well, there you go. Yeah. So I think that's a fair criticism that it's not really the way the founders wanted. In that sense, it still serves some of these other functions, though, balancing regional interest and small and large populations.
Yeah, excellent point.
So what are some key ways that the system has changed or adapted since maybe the early 18th century, the Electoral College system?
Well, the first major change would be the 12th Amendment, which was passed in 1804, subsequent to the election of 1800, again, in which the electors' behavior amendment requires that you cast essentially a candidate choice based on I say kind of a slate, the idea that you cast two ballots purposefully, one for president, one for vice president. And so this makes it difficult. This accommodates the idea that people can vote on a party ticket. And it recognizes that ability. It also changes the number of people that would go to a runoff in the House. The initial number was 5. Well, the more you have, the harder it is to choose from. Arrow's paradox, the concept that the more choices you have, the more difficult it is to make a decision. So they cut that number from 5 to 3, making it easier for the House to decide this if it goes to the House. So those would be some structural changes. In addition, you have the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, which gives D.C. 3 electoral votes.
1961. Yeah.
Then you also have the 22nd Amendment, which limits the president to 2 terms. So you have some, institutionally speaking, some changes that have happened that way. And then also,
go ahead.
There's just greater democratization.
The broadening of the electorate.
Yeah, broadening of the electorate. And then also requiring that out of 48 out of 50 states that it's a winner-take-all system for the electoral votes. Those are some of the major changes.
And of course, we've made the threshold, the minimums up to 270 now, so that number's gotten bigger. We could mention also, I guess, with the issue of the 13th through the 15th Amendments too, and then also the 19th Amendment, broadening the franchise, right, for African American males by 1870.
Right after the Civil War.
Again, the females will have to wait at the national level until 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So you got the 15th Amendment for voting rights for African American males.
First statement on voting rights in the Constitution too. Is the 15th Amendment.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And then the 19th Amendment, we just had the 100th anniversaries this year. The women's suffrage movement, which had been building for decades. That's the 19th Amendment. And that expanded the voting franchise significantly. I think it was like 26 million potential new voters right there just with the women's vote in 1920 at the national level. And, of course, some of the states, the western states back in the 1870s and 80s had allowed women to vote locally and statewide because women were a rare commodity, so how would we bring them out to the West? But at the national level, you get 26 million potentially new voters. That's almost a quarter of the population in 1920, 106 million according to the 1920 census. So again, that kind of builds on like what Dr. Mason said with the African American vote there. So a lot more people to account for.
Were there some significant have there been some significant controversies and problems through American history with the Electoral College system that maybe spurred some calls for reform to it?
Yes.
We definitely have heard that since 2000 at least, but going farther back than that.
Well, I was going to mention too, with even the faithless electors, you'll get those occasionally, not very often, for the reasons we've discussed, but we did have a few back in 2016.
Yeah.
Remember that on the West Coast?
I think 8. I could be. I think it was 8.
It was more than usual. I don't remember hearing of that many. But we have some elections that.
1824 is probably the best example, which is so much fun to talk. We were just talking about this in class the other day with one of our classes.
Honors class, on the presidential election.
Which is the election of Andrew Jackson. It's the first election it's Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, start over. Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. And basically, no one receives a majority in the Electoral College. Although Jackson wins the popular vote, he's the favorite there. But then it goes to the House, and then there's skullduggery in the House. Imagine that. I always tell students, you cannot create a system where politicians are allowed to make a decision and then expect them to not behave politically, right? It's like having a little kitten and wanting it to grow up to become a German Shepherd, and when it's not doing everything you want because it's a full-grown cat. And I love cats, by the way. I love dogs, but it's not a shepherd. It's going to follow its nature.
Yeah,
so
it's in their nature.
Follow their nature. Well, when you charge the House of Representatives with picking, they're going to behave politically, right? Well, so what happens is John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay get together, and Clay says, well, we don't know this for sure, but this is the result. Clay emerges as the Secretary of State after he throws his support in the House, and he provides the state of Kentucky's electors, well, the congressmen to vote. And they should have voted for Henry Clay because they're from Kentucky. But he says, no, I vote for him. And so Adams wins. Clay becomes Secretary of State, which was seen as a jumping off point for the presidency at that time. So he's thinking 1828, right? Maybe get rid of Adams here.
Thinking ahead.
And so Jackson says, there's been a corrupt bargain struck here. And
he's the winner of the popular vote.
Exactly. I should. And so that's one of the early elections where you see people beginning to say, and Jackson says, we should just have this direct popular vote. But Jackson, again, is a devotee of Jefferson. Although Jefferson didn't particularly care for Jackson, he had some choice words about him. And Jefferson will live 2 more years after that. He dies in 1826. So he sees this election. But he doesn't live to see Jackson elected in 28. Maybe that was a good thing for Jefferson.
That's
right. But he was a devotee of the Democratic Party, out of which Jefferson had created. And so Jackson is following this thinking of Jefferson that, we need to have Jeffersonian democracy, where we just take a vote and we win. It's that simple. And, of course, that perspective is embraced by a lot of people today, and there's a rationale for it.
No, that's right.
Of course. It's not crazy to say that the majority of the people should rule, should govern. We use the word govern, not rule. I was still saying kings rule, people govern.
Good point.
In our
Good
system,
distinction, yes.
Yeah, subtle but important. So I would say 1824 is an important one. Certainly, you even had that in 1800, of course, with Jefferson and Adams, but I don't think to the same extent. I think ever since 1824 we've had more of that. And again, that coincides with Jacksonian democracy and this expanding of the franchise. And
we had another intrigue in 1876, which had a big legacy, which resulted a little compromising in the House when we have, let's see who was running here in 76. You had Rutherford B.
Hayes. And how quickly we forget Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden, yeah.
And, of course, Hayes was a Republican.
Yes.
And, of course, we had Reconstruction going on. Yes. And part of the deal for Hayes to get the vote in the House was to basically dismantle the Reconstruction in the South. So
troops out of Florida.
So again, it's kind of like 1800, 1804. You don't have a majority of the electoral votes, but that was very controversial, and it had a big impact on, of course, civil rights and voting rights, even after the 15th Amendment for African American males up until the 1960s.
I don't remember even thinking much about the Electoral College until 2000. Then we all sort of became temporary experts.
We're really privileged to live in the early 21st century. Right? Get the 2000 election, the 2016, kind of unusual elections.
Great for civics education.
I say it's interesting. I say interesting. I don't know if that's a curse or not. If it's interesting, the old Chinese curse. But yeah, that's right. That was the first time for me too to think a little bit more about that with the case of Florida. Yeah, just what was it, 500 votes. That determined
one county, right?
One county.
It's really amazing too when you think about how we've come from. For those of us that are old enough to remember the 1980s, when you had Ronald Reagan, who, when you look at the electoral maps, and I love to show these to my students. I'll show them 2016, 2012, and then they don't believe that 2008 was a real year. Anything before that didn't really happen. Right?
Most of our students don't remember 9/11. They don't remember.
That was in the mists of time, Precambrian area or something. Yes. But I say, if you look at the election of 1984, where President Reagan wins this just incredible.
It's a lot of red on that map.
In fact, he does better after it being an incumbent, right? And a lot of people, you think about, you're the president of the United States, well, you're going to agitate a lot of people being president. President Reagan wins 49 states. He only loses the District of Columbia and Minnesota, I believe.
Yeah, and that was Mondale's home
state. And that, I mean, you're talking about a president who could win Texas and Minnesota. or excuse me, and Massachusetts.
And
he can win California and Mississippi. So this is
part of Greek mythology. You're talking
sort of, yeah.
Greco-Roman here.
First President Bush, he does all right. He does pretty well. And President Clinton, you start to see this changing a little bit. President Clinton still wins convincingly. So does President Bush. So does President Obama. They win enough, but you start to see it dwindle. Yeah. But then when you get to for second President Bush, then you just see this real tightening of it, and we've never really recovered. I mean. Again, Obama won sufficiently. He won. There's no issue with that. President Trump, when you look at the Electoral College, he wins convincingly.
Yeah, the winner.
He wins
take all,
convincingly because it's designed to do. It's designed to exaggerate the winner's margin. But if we're really fair about the numbers,
to make it look like there's a mandate for the
right?
president,
Yeah.
Which Robert Dahl talks about the myth of the presidential mandate, which is an interesting debate. But at the end of the day, it is something. Not that it's the end of the republic or anything like that. We've been here before. We've had tight elections. What we just have to find a consensus candidate, and that's the problematic issue.
Probably in a kind of a realignment for both of the major political parties. We're due for that about every 70 to 80 years. So,
yeah, in fact, we divided up into
cycles.
The party eras. The party era, this year, this. We're definitely in need of that, and
both parties.
Both parties are, in some ways, working with outdated models. Toward the
and
electorate.
also, there's a generational transition going on with of course, Biden's really the pre-boomer generation, just at the tail end of what they call the silent generation that grew up in the Depression and World War II as children. Then we have the boomers, and then the Xers are us, and then we have the millennials, and then I'm not sure what the newest batch is, but we're also in the generational cycle. But about every 4 generations or so, we have to kind of reevaluate. So we've kind of been through this before. It's disconcerting, but the good thing is that we've done this before. We can survive. And
there's a model for coming
back
to.
Yeah. It's just we're kind of in the midst of it. It takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
And actually, as bad as it's been, and I appreciate people who are concerned with it, and that's good. We love the country, want the country to survive. And
we want people to have a stake in the system too.
Yeah. But the one thing we haven't had is we have been able to get it resolved in the Electoral College. We haven't had it go back to the House for a long time.
Yeah.
So I think that's even more devastating for the country. I would argue when it goes to the House, the wheels come off because people who don't like the Electoral College, and rightfully so, they charge that this is a violation of the fundamental idea of separation of powers. Now you have the legislative branch picking the president, and I think that really can delegitimize a president more than not winning the popular vote. And I've been grateful that we've not had that yet, because now I'm all for the system working. If that's where we go, that's where we go. But I think that's really the gut check that we would have to undergo at that point.
This podcast will live on after November, so we might have to go back and adjust the way we think about this. But who knows what will happen in November 2020?
Post-apocalyptic podcast. Yeah, that's kind of a tongue twister there.
But you think about like in 1800 when they balloted 36 times. It took 36 ballots to get Jefferson elected.
And it was Hamilton, his enemy, that helped sway that.
Going behind people's back, and the consummate. I like Hamilton, but the consummate wheeler and dealer guy, and other people were involved too. But that was very difficult for the country, and so was 1824. A lot of people
bargain. Jackson put it.
A lot of people, but to his credit, Jackson didn't say, "Okay, well, I think Tennessee should secede from the Union."
Yeah,
he did what a good politician would do. He said, we got to go to work. We got to defeat the Adams administration.
Right.
And on day one, he's opposed him and made it clear, I'm running in 1828 and I'm going to beat you. And he did. I mean, he beat him
convincingly,
like a drum.
Right?
So, so this is the first time we actually have the election cycle starting the day after the election. So we think campaigning is always all the time now for at least 2 or 3 years now. That's the first instance there.
Busy campaign. Yeah.
Very modern.
Absolutely.
Well, Dr. Schmaltz, you alluded to this earlier about how the Electoral College system affects the way candidates campaign. Can we talk about that a little bit? Like, how does this system change the way candidates approach how they speak to the electorate, where they go to campaign?
And of course, we always have those swing states are always very important. Think of Ohio and what's another? Florida,
North
Carolina.
We don't see a lot of candidates coming to Oklahoma.
Not to Oklahoma or North Dakota, where I came from, even Nebraska sometimes, right? But I've heard this argument. I know, Dr. Mason, you've made this too. It does kind of force the candidates to have to campaign in certain states. Remember in 2016 too, both parties were looking at ways of getting the electoral vote. And of course, there was some criticism later of Hillary Clinton that she didn't go to Wisconsin or Michigan. These were typically, Democrat leaning states. But again, this was a strange election. And there was some criticism of that. But she didn't go there personally to campaign. So this does kind of force the candidates to have to reach out to at least a broader electorate. And again, that ties in with this idea of trying to bind the different regions, the different interests together within the federal system. And that's, as I've gotten older, I've come to appreciate that more, that federal aspect of it, and this idea of, especially between the smaller populous states and the larger. So that kind of forces candidates to do that. But even after they're elected, I've heard the argument too, this forces them, even if you win the election, if you want to broaden your appeal, you may go to other states and try to win them over as well. So as candidates, both who are wanting to be elected the first time and those running for re-election, it does kind of force them not just to go to California or Texas or New York or just Florida, but into other parts of the country. Again, not all the states maybe, but at least if different regions do get some attention there. So I think that's a healthy thing within the federal system. So I think that's something that stands out for me. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Dr.
No, I
Mace.
think
Is that kind of the gist of it.
I think that's the traditional understanding of it in that way.
Yeah.
And that's been true not just in recent years, but even back
forever.
in the 19th century. Candidates have had to sort of appeal to different parts of the country.
Yeah. And even Trump, again, interesting election cycle coming up here. He's trying to appeal to the African-American voters. Even it might be a very small percentage that may support him. It might be much higher than he had. Who knows? We'll see. Than he had even back in 2016, which was higher than what Romney had. Same thing with Hispanics. So he's even targeting certain parts of the population. I wish they would just target just citizens, but they do kind of look at certain communities within the nation. And so those people, those blocks, voting blocks, are very important. So even Trump going for a re-election, he's trying to appeal to a broader segment, just in case some of these swing states are going to be really razor close. That extra 1 or 2% of the African American vote can make all the difference in the world, or the Hispanic vote. So I've heard that argument in recent months too. We'll see.
And there are some interesting quirks of the system that I wanted to mention too. Just in doing some research for this episode, I learned that basically there are over 4 million U.S. citizens who aren't represented in the Electoral College. These are the people living in places like Puerto Rico and other territories. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah,
yes.
the exact number I'm not sure, but it is a traditional criticism. In the sense, and this goes back to the issue of the primacy of states. That states are the issue, that the president is the president of the United States. Now, that also means he's the president of the federal territories as well, but that word states always is privileged. And so Article 2 says that the electors shall be selected by the states in a manner chosen by their state legislatures. And so, yes, those people will living in those territories cannot vote in the general election. They may vote in primary elections or caucuses if the parties select to have one in Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands. And you'll see them at not this one because we didn't have people at our conventions this last time, but
virtually.
You'll oftentimes see those delegates holding up a sign, Puerto Rico, Guam, at both of the respective conventions, or any other third party that chooses to run in those places as well. And again, those people, just make it clear, they are United States citizens. They're as much a citizen as I am or anybody else born in the state of the United States, and they are entitled to all the rights as being U.S. citizens by virtue of the 14th Amendment, which extends citizenship to all persons born in any state or any jurisdiction any place subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. So if they, it's a matter of residency, I always say. If they move to a state or to D.C., and they are compliant with the laws of that state and are a qualified elector according to the laws of that state, like anybody else, they're allowed to vote, as they certainly should be. And I always use the example that it's about residency. So if I were to go, I'm a registered voter, I'm a qualified elector in Oklahoma. If I happen to take a trip the first week in November or the last week in October or both, and I get stuck somewhere or I'm in another state, I can't vote. If I haven't already early voted, if I haven't absentee balloted.
Yeah.
So I'm not defending, I'm not attacking the system. I'm just saying I think the traditional explanation that it's about residency. And again, that applies to all of us. So, but it's a legitimate point to raise, and I appreciate you raising it. It's also, though, I would say this is not so much a factor of the Electoral College, whereas this is an issue where the Constitution, again, is silent on the issue of who is a voter. It kicks that decision back to the states.
It's like you say with property qualifications, all of that. Here we have residency being an issue.
Right.
Okay,
Residency is the issue. And so, and again, that word state gets in the way. So that's why you had to have the 23rd Amendment to permit D.C. Because D.C. is essentially a territory. It's essentially a federal territory in that sense. It's designated by Congress under the Enclave Clause of Article 1 of the Constitution, where it permitted the federal government to establish a permanent seat of government eventually, because it was written before the D.C. existed. So it's a fair question. It's a good question. But that, I think, is the traditional answer.
Well, we have a disclaimer that we use in every episode where we say the views expressed in this episode don't reflect those of Oklahoma Humanities. So please feel free to express your own views. I'll ask you a very controversial question here.
OU or OSU?
That's easy, but I won't say. Everybody that knows me knows the answer.
That's too much. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, I really did want to ask if you personally feel like this is the best way we could possibly elect a president, or are there some alternate versions or a tweak to the system that you think might be more effective?
Well, that's a good question. And I've kind of evolved over the years on many topics, including federalism, which I've come to grow to appreciate as I've gotten older. I used to want to centralize everything, but probably my personal preference is to maintain the Electoral College. Again, not that it can't be reformed, and it doesn't dismiss some of the criticisms either, by the way. But I do kind of like the district plan. I guess it's a little bit more nuanced where you can break it down. Or the Moon plan like Maine and Nebraska. I can see that maybe being even more viable, more representative. But my concern is all the different regions. Again, we're such a diverse, such a large country, 330 million persons. I mean, we're the third most populous country in the world. People often forget that after both India and China, respectively, because they're much, much larger than we are. But with diverse interests, diverse heritages, diverse traditions, and again, between rural and the urban dichotomy, which has grown since the early 20th century. Again, if you look over the flyover country versus the coast, you have dominant cities, very large populous areas in California, New York, especially in the Southwest, Texas, and of course, Florida. Again, if we go to a popular vote only, maybe not a modified electoral system, I do worry about kind of a splintering of the system, especially for those states and those populations who feel maybe they don't have a voice. So I tend to favor the Electoral College, but again, the district plan I can kind of see as one solution. And the other plan too, isn't there one also being proposed, or I don't know if a couple of states do this, where the idea of the state can cast its electoral votes towards the general popular vote.
Yeah, there's different versions of that. Yeah.
It's being proposed anyway. I don't know if it's been implemented. Yeah. I'm not sure so much about that.
Variances of that.
Yeah, but the district plan, I could see that. Again, we only have 2 states, but again, the states could decide that. But I tend to favor that because I think that federal system is so important to maintain, to protect these different interests.
Yeah, not to be redundant, but
go ahead.
Redundancy is good. I think the Electoral College has actually served us well, and I know a lot of people will agree with that. A lot of people disagree with that, and that's okay. It should never be about, well, my person won or my person didn't win. Mm-hmm. The question is the long-term track record of the process, and I think it's been good. I think overall it's done very well. Republics just don't last that long, and ours has. And it's because we've avoided, I think, in large measure, we've avoided the excesses of the pitfalls of direct popular election, and we've also avoided some of the excesses of the extreme parties that you find in other countries. And one of the things the Electoral College does tend to do is, without getting into too much, it tends to moderate some of these extremes because of the way presidents have to the way presidential candidates have to campaign in diverse states all over the country.
Kind of broad appeal.
Yeah, broad appeal. Yeah. And I use the example of the election of 1860 as to why I think it's a good system. Lincoln only gets 39% of the popular vote. 39. It's 39.6.
Is that the lowest popular vote?
I think he is the lowest vote getter to ever win to ever win the election. To win. 39%. And Lincoln doesn't win a single electoral vote because he doesn't appear on the ballot in any of the southern states. So, and again, now to be fair, the detractors of my statement here will say, yeah, but there were 4 candidates running, blah, blah, blah. If there were only 2, okay, but this is the point. The way the system works is there are difficulties in even getting on the ballot. So you may have had more candidates running, and the country had been more fractured. And I think we would all agree, at least I would hope, that Abraham Lincoln was the best guy to win that election, and we're happy that the nation was reunited, that it became stronger after that. There was a lot of difficulties after the war, but we're happy that slavery is eliminated. All of these things come out of this candidacy. It certainly wouldn't have come out of Stephen Douglas. It wouldn't have come out of John Breckinridge,
and even Lincoln himself wouldn't have anticipated some of the outcomes of this. Even
and Lincoln had to work within that system of. I've said this before. He kind of hurries the admission of Nevada in 1864 to pad that electoral vote. Make sure I've got some good Republicans in that territorial government when we make it a state, and let's get West Virginia back in here.
And then also the getting the furloughs for the federal soldiers who were more supportive of him to vote to make that election of 1864 a success.
A little arm twisting there, but
that's the first time we have something like that happen.
In the end, I'm a pragmatist, and I always say also for those who want to change the Electoral College, we have an amendment process, and the founders gave us this. And the founders, I think, would be a little bit, for someone who really respects the founders like I do and hold them in great esteem for most of them, I think that we do them a disservice when we say that we can't change anything. We can. They gave us Article 5 of the Constitution.
Some flexibility there.
And so if we can come up with a way, I always say for me, the most important thing is regional balance. We have to find a way to bring Wyoming and California together. And we gotta love them both. We gotta say, y'all are equally important to us. Now, the people in California laugh at that and say, well, there's 39 million of us. There's 586,000 of them.
We should be more equal.
We should be more equal, right? But we can all, and we can understand that perspective. That's a legitimate point. There's nothing illegitimate about saying this is holding us back. I hear this from the California crowd a lot. But the problem is, again, it's the same principle that the Senate is based upon. It's a very malapportioned process. The Senate does not recognize one person, one vote. It doesn't begin to. So if you're going to change the Electoral College based on that,
per state.
It's completely maladjusted. It's malapportioned. But that's there for a reason. So I always say if there's a way that you can satisfy the numerical difference between these states and keep everybody happy or happy enough, I'm fine with it.
And I was going to add,
I think the founders would be okay with that because we have to adapt, we have to change. But the problems they confronted are the same problems we have today. National union.
And issues of compromise. I know you've always often talked about, Dr. Mason, in your classes, but if we are going to have an amendment process, there are going to have to be some compromises between the smaller states and the larger states. There's going to have to be some give and take to keep that union. The one thing I just wanted to add to your argument, again, in 2016, the losing side tends to really dislike the Electoral College. I know I've been on the losing side, winning side at different times, and it's time to revamp the system, especially when I was younger. Okay, maybe, but
just like the college football playoff system,
college football playoffs. We got to revamp it. We need to have an amendment process or something.
Some
another one
on that. We'll have to talk about that.
Yeah, that's a whole other episode.
Convention, special extra legal. But there was talk even among Democrats back in 2016 in the Hillary campaign. They were sure they had that blue firewall set up. And that again, that would be like some of the states we've mentioned before, and Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania and. Some of those, it didn't work out. And then all of a sudden you hear calls for we need to, get rid of the system. And you hear it on the other side too sometimes when they're on the losing end. So everybody was already gearing their election campaigns, going to use the electoral process to their advantage. And then when you lose, then you say, well, we're going to scrap it. And of course, they were surefire, thought they had a firewall. So they actually believed in the system until the night after. But that's that disappointment, for partisans. But then you have to pick up again, and whatever side you're on, you have to go from there and lick your wounds. Do some soul searching and decide, okay, well, how come we lost the election?
Just like Jackson did.
As tough as it is.
And I know Jackson's a controversial figure, but I think people could agree that his decision he didn't lead a secession movement. He just said, we need to beat Adams. Yeah. And that's what he did. So, it's up to the opposition to prove why the decision that the electorate made should not be repeated in the subsequent election.
But that bitterness is real. And again, some of the criticisms certainly can sympathize with. And we need to be sensitive to that, But at any rate, that's kind of something I wanted to throw in there for consideration.
Well, thank you so much for coming in to talk about the Electoral College. It's such a timely issue. I really appreciate you guys coming back on the show.
We appreciate you guys hosting it. It's
a great opportunity. And again, I'm a big supporter of the humanities. I consider myself part of that despite being in social sciences because I'm dealing with the human condition. So I want to thank you for allowing us to have a part in this.
Would you like to mention anything that's going on at Northwestern currently?
Well, just for Constitution Day, because of the coronavirus, we're doing more physical distancing. So we didn't have any guest speakers, but we did have one of our colleagues from the National Archives. She was able to get a display case for our university main library in Alva for the 19th Amendment for the women's suffrage. Oh. So we kind of put that up there for a few weeks here. We're going to have that on the 100th anniversary of that passage of the 19th Amendment. So that's something more recently we've done. I'm trying to think what else we're keeping busy. We're doing an honors class for presidential elections, especially Dr. Mason.
And of course, as everybody, that we're in a holding pattern on everything we do with COVID. But if anyone's interested, they can check out our website at the Institute for Citizenship Studies. Yep. There's a link on the Northwestern webpage, and if we will be able to have our presidential lecture series, which is every spring in March and April. Hopefully we'll be able to do that. We had some plans for that, so just stay tuned if you're interested.
Yeah. Cool. We'll put a link to that on our webpage.
And
we're
still, and we're revamping some aspects of the website too. So some of it might be a little bit dated, but I'm working. Yeah. We're doing some training for the chairs. Each chair does the website design, so we'll get that updated. But there's a lot of information up there that's already set to go for the public, but we are going to be making some additions and some modifications just to kind of upgrade things as we move forward.
Okay. Well, thank you for mentioning that. And thank you again for coming on the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great. You can check out our website at okhumanities.org/brainbox for additional information about some of the topics we discussed in this episode. And we encourage you to comment about what you've heard on the Brainbox podcast. You can leave comments through the Podbean app and the okhumanities.org/brainbox website and on social media by using #BrainboxOK. Please give us a rating, and you can also email comments and ideas for future episodes to us at brainbox@okhumanities.org. Thank you to Blacken Studios. You can find out more about Blacken Studios at blackenstudio.com and on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our theme music was composed by Jeff Mareva, and this program is funded by Oklahoma Humanities. Any views expressed in the podcast do not necessarily represent those of Oklahoma Humanities. This has been Brainbox, a podcast for your noggin.